There are these moments in history that sound so small that you feel like they shouldn't matter. And then you take a closer look and you realize that this little thing could explain an entire country. And May 16th, 1866 was one of those moments. On paper, it was the day that United States Congress established the nickel. That sounds harmless enough. Sounds tiny, even. You can almost hear the modern reaction already. I can hear you guys saying a whole story about a nickel? Really? And once you start pulling on that thread, the whole fabric begins to move. So bear with me. I'm going to be talking about war, greed, shortages, vanity, industrial lobbying, awkward design, missing silver, furious lawmakers, and a government so desperate for small change that it ended up creating one of the most stubborn little coins in American history. This was not just about the birth of a coin. It was the birth of a solution made under pressure, and like many American solutions, it was practical, political, profitable, and quite a bit absurd. And to understand why the nickel mattered, we have to step back into a world that did not work the way that we automatically assume that it did. In the mid-19th century, Americans did not simply stroll around with neat pockets full of identical coins ready for every transaction they were going to make. Currency was messy. A lot of times it was local, it was inconsistent. Sometimes the coins were scarce. Sometimes paper money was distrusted. A lot of times. And sometimes people hoarded what was valuable and spent only what they felt was annoying to them. Then came the Civil War, and whatever fragile sense of order existed in everyday money became a part of the problem, and it came apart at the seams. Gold and silver coins, what people called specie, vanished from circulation. They were hoarded, they were hidden and exported, or simply just pulled out of everyday use because when fear shows up in such great abundance, precious metal suddenly looks a lot more comforting than patriotism. You don't spend what you think you're going to need later. So ordinary commerce started choking on its own lack of small change. And that created a surprisingly serious problem. Because a country does not just need money for large purchases. People need money for bread, back then, especially for tobacco, for train fares, for coffee, for tools, for a night's lodging, for soap, for wages broken into smaller amounts. The sort of money that people use most often is not glamorous money. It's the small stuff. It's the coins that change hands constantly. And when those disappear, everything becomes awkward. Merchants have to improvise. Customers get shortchanged. Trust phrase. Little irritations pile up into daily nonsense. We see this now with the penny shortages in a lot of fast food restaurants, but this is exactly what's happening in abundance during the Civil War years. Since official coinage was scarce, the marketplace began inventing workarounds. Merchants created tokens that were circulating. Postage stamps were used in strange little makeshift ways, and sometimes we see that in prisons even now. Fractional paper currency appeared in tiny denominations instead of coins. The entire situation felt like a nation that was trying to run a machine using parts from 3 different toolboxes and a spoon. So here's where the story gets really wonderfully odd. The United States already had a 5-cent coin before the nickel came along. It was called the half dime. And in the early age of the Republic, it was spelled D-I-S-M-E, even though it was still pronounced dime. It had been there from the very beginning, right back to the early federal minting efforts, when the young republic was still improvising its own machinery of government. The first half dimes were struck in 1792, not in some grand completed mint building, but in the cellar of a sawmaker named John Harper in Philadelphia, because the actual mint was still under construction. That alone tells you how raw and unfinished the early federal project really was. They were still making national coinage, but it was in the basement of somebody's home, while the official mint was still becoming itself. It almost sounds, suspiciously American. The legend around those, really the half first dimes, the first half dimes, only adds to the atmosphere. According to later recollection, the silver bullion for those coins may have been provided by President George Washington himself, perhaps from his own household silver, maybe donated from his silverware. Whether every detail of that story is true or not, the image is irresistible, of course. The first president quietly feeding his silver into the creation of the nation's first tiny coinage, because the country desperately needed small money in circulation. It feels ceremonial and practical at the same time, which is a fair summary of the early republic, of course. Even Washington mentioned in an annual message that a small beginning had been made in the coinage of half dimes because the want of small coins had demanded immediate attention. That need for small change was present from the start. The problem did not begin so much later in the Civil War. The war just made it far worse. The half dime had a long and uneven life. It was tiny and silver and sometimes inconveniently valuable in a world where silver had international appeal. By the early 19th century, American coins were being exported and melted down because they could be traded profitably elsewhere. That's one of the less romantic truths about coinage. If those coins were created using silver donated by Washington himself, very few of them exist today. A coin is not just a patriotic object. It's also a metal. And if the metal is worth more somewhere else, the coin starts to travel. The United States actually suspended the striking of some silver denominations for stretches of time because the coins were simply not staying put. Half dimes disappeared from production for years. Later, they returned. They changed designs. They survived. But by the 1860s, silver 5-cent pieces were simply too vulnerable to hoarding and disappearance in a stressed economy. The country needed a 5-cent coin that people would not spend and not squirrel away like a dragon with anxiety. This is where the word nickel begins to march onto the stage. At first glance, it looks like a straightforward material choice, using a base metal instead of a precious silver. Yeah, it makes sense. It makes the coin durable. It makes it less tempting to hoard. And it makes it simple, except, of course, nothing involving American money, Congress, and industrial interests is ever simple. So enter Joseph Wharton, who is an industrialist, a businessman, and a man with a very convenient relationship to the metal nickel. He held a near monopoly over nickel mining in the United States, and astonishingly enough, he was very enthusiastic about seeing more nickel used in federal coinage. It was one of those moments in history where the official explanation and the profitable explanation hold hands without even pretending to be strangers. Wharton had already pushed for the nickel's use in other coins. Some of those efforts had failed and some of them had succeeded. By the time the 5-cent coin question arose, he was positioned perfectly. The country needed a practical metal for low denominational coinage. He controlled the supply of one candidate. Friends in Congress were receptive to this idea. The mint was under pressure to fix a real problem. This was the kind of historical alignment that makes reform happen very quickly and very suspiciously at the same time. It was not that the need was fake. The need was very real. But the route to the solution was lined with people who stood to benefit. And that's one reason this story feels so modern. It's about convenience, yes, but it's also about who gets rich when convenience becomes policy. Mint officials had mixed feelings. Mint director James Pollock had not always liked nickel in coinage, yet he came around to supporting a 5-cent piece made from copper and nickel, especially after the initial popularity of the other base metal coins. Remember, at this point, the government had already begun experimenting with lower value, lower intrinsic worth coinage to kind of refill the daily circulation. Bronze cents and 2-cent pieces had been introduced. A copper nickel 3-cent coin existed. These coins had low metal value compared with face value, which was exactly the point. People spent these. They did not hide them under their floorboards or their pillows or their mattresses. Pollock recognized that a 5-cent coin in base metal might become a practical substitute for the 5-cent note. That note, by the way, was about to become part of the strangest little scandals of this whole story. Because here comes the twist that no one inventing a fictional script would dare to include without being accused of overdoing it. One of the sparks that helped to propel the creation of the nickel was a government official named Spencer M. Clark, who somehow managed to place his own likeness on federal paper money while still being very much alive. It wasn't the face of Washington, not Jefferson, not some revered dead statesman whose memory had entered the national mythology. It was himself. It's difficult to describe how breathtakingly brazen it was without sounding disrespectful to modern egotists who really have worked very hard to keep standards pretty high. Congress was appalled. Outrage erupted. Laws were moved to not only help kill off the 5-cent note, but also prohibited any live person from ever appearing on federal currency again. So yes, one reason the country leaned so hard on the 5-cent coin was because one astonishingly self-impressed official put his own face where it absolutely did not belong. If ever there was proof that a human vanity can leave metallic consequences in your mouth, this was it. So on May 16th of 1866, Congress finally passed the legislation that established the new 5-cent coin. It would be made of 75% copper and 25% nickel. It would weigh 5 grams or close enough to it after the committee revisions. It would be legal tender up to $1. The Treasury would exchange it in limited ways. Fraction paper currency under 10 cents would begin to disappear. It all sounds neat when it's written into law, but laws are elegant in a way that actual objects often are not. The real coin still had to be designed and produced and accepted by the public, and that's where the nickel's life became about as awkward as my teenage brother when we were kids. The first nickel design is what we now call the shield nickel. It was designed by a man by the name of James B. Longacre, the Mint's chief engraver, and it looked exactly like what you might expect from a nation fresh out of war and still unsure whether to stand at attention or sit down and scream into their pillows. The obverse featured a large shield. The reverse had a big numeral 5 surrounded by stars and rays. It was meant to symbolize national strength and order. In practice, many people thought it looked severe and gloomy and not a little unpleasant. One critic compared it to a tombstone. It's not the kind of review a newborn coin really wants. But the shield nickel had larger problems than aesthetics. It was difficult to strike properly. The metal was hard. The planchets were stubborn. The dies broke quickly, and the rays around the reverse complicated production enough that the Mint removed them the very next year. So America had just created a brand new coin because the economy needed a reliable small coinage, and immediately the coin itself became a nuisance to manufacture. It's such a perfect detail. It captures how the very first fix to the big problem is just a smaller problem made of metal. The shield nickel did circulate, and it did help some, but it was not graceful. Merchants accumulated too many of them. Banks were sometimes reluctant to take them in quantity. The Treasury had to adjust its redemption policies because store owners did not want to be buried in nickels they could not easily move. The coin was just too useful to fail and too inconvenient to love. Still, love was never really the point, and it never really is with money. It's about utility. And on that score, the nickel slowly began to win. By late 1860s and into the 70s, enough of them were in circulation to make a difference. Their base metal composition meant that people would spend them. Their larger size made them visible to and distinct. The old silver half dimes continued for a time, but their late fate was pretty much sealed. They were abolished in the Act of 1873, one of those legislative moments that sounds dry until you realize it was the official death certificate for an entire branch of national money. At that time, the nickel had the field to itself and the nation's 5-cent piece. And then, like many successful survivors, it began to evolve. The shield design, of course, like I mentioned, is not going to last forever. In 1883, it was replaced by the Liberty head nickel. I used to have one of those. I wish I still did. It was sometimes called the V nickel because of the Roman numeral on the reverse. This design brought a whole new comedy with it. The first version did not include the word cents. Criminals realized that the new coin was roughly similar in size to the $5 gold piece, and some plated the nickel in gold and passed it off as a much more valuable coin than it was. Imagine being swindled because the government forgot to print the value on the coin. The mint had to rush to correct the design, and a word cents was added to the coin. It's almost sweet in a disastrous way how often coin history turns into a parade of human opportunism, sprinting faster than federal design sense can. The Liberty head nickel had a long life. By the late 19th century, it was becoming more and more important in everyday commerce. This is where the nickel stops being just a legislative curiosity and started becoming a little engine of modern life. Coin-operated machines were spreading. Vending devices, gambling machines, mechanical entertainment, automats, early movie houses, all of these found the nickel beautifully suited to their needs. The very word Nickelodeon tells you how embedded the coin had become. A 5-cent piece was not just money. It was admission, amusement, snack, convenience, chance, and noise. It could buy a sandwich from a machine, music from a piano, or a flicker of moving pictures in a dark room. The nickel helped to shape habits. It became the price of a little temporary escape. That matters because coins are often treated as passive objects, but they do not just reflect society. They help to structure it. The penny buys one kind of behavior. The nickel buys another. Once the nickel became the standard little coin of cheap entertainment and quick transactions, it helped define what small pleasures cost. It slid into everyday American life so smoothly that people stopped really noticing it, which is perhaps the highest compliment a practical coin can receive. It stopped being controversial and became normal. That's how you know something has won. But the nickel's visual identity kept changing within the country. In 1913, the Liberty head design gave way to the buffalo nickel, with its Native American portrait on the obverse and a bison on the reverse. This was a dramatic break from the earlier motifs and remains one of the most beloved American coin designs ever made. It was also difficult to strike well, and the date wore off so quickly that countless surviving buffalo nickels look as though time simply licked the numerals away. Then in 1938 came the Jefferson nickel. The one most Americans would recognize instantly was Thomas Jefferson on the face and Monticello on the reverse. It was born in a design competition, refined by mint demands, and issued just before another global crisis would alter its metal again. During the Second World War, nickel itself became strategically important, just as it had been in a different way during the Civil War. So from 1942 to 1945, wartime nickels were struck in an alloy that removed nickel entirely and substituted silver, copper, and manganese. To make them identifiable, the mint placed a large mint mark above the Monticello, including the first ever P for Philadelphia on the United States coin. Even the nickel, this little humble everyday coin, had to adapt when war bent the economy around itself. That pattern echoes on the coin's birth so perfectly and almost feels planned by a novelist. In hard times, the 5-cent piece changes so the nation can keep moving. And that little thing is pretty hardy. It just keeps doing that too. And yet, for all the redesigns and alloy changes, the core reason for the nickel's existence has stayed remarkably consistent. America needs a sturdy, spendable, low-denomination coin that people will actually use. That sounds simple, but has always been surprisingly difficult. In recent years, metal values have again made nickel nickel cost more to manufacture than its face value. There have been studies and reports and suggestions that it be altered and changed or eliminated altogether. Economists grumble, practical people shrug, traditionalists, of course, cling. And the nickel survives, which feels deeply in character for the United States of America. It was born from shortage and argument. Of course, it's meant to still be here, arguing with arithmetic. And there's something almost poetic to that. The coin established on May 16th of 1866 came into existence because silver vanished. Paper proved awkward and vain. And industries' interests, all of them leaned in. Congress got angry. The country needed something solid and spendable. It was not born elegant or beloved. It was born out of necessity. And necessary things often last longer than beautiful things do because daily life depends on them. The nickel is one of those objects. It's easy to ignore, impossible to fully replace without consequence, and it's woven into the habits of ordinary people for generations. So when you hold a nickel, you're not just holding a trivial object. You're holding a fragment of war economics, industrial lobbying, bureaucratic vanity, mint frustration, commercial evolution, and national adaptation. You're holding the answer to a very old American question. What do we do when the system is under pressure and the small stuff starts to fail? In 1866, the answer was this little blunt coin. Not silver, not grand, not glorious, just useful enough, awkward enough, and durable enough to keep the country making change. And maybe that's the most fitting thing about the nickel. It has never really represented American ideals at their most noble. It has represented America in a more honest way, improvised, pressured, practical, influenced by moneyed interests, occasionally ridiculous, and somehow still effective enough to survive. For a coin worth 5 cents, that's a remarkable biography. So here's the question I want to leave you with today. What does it say about a country when one of its most enduring coins was born not from beauty or symbolism, but from shortage, lobbying, outrage, and the desperate need to keep everyday life from falling apart? And of course, as always, if you enjoy stories like this, make sure you follow the History Happens Facebook page for more deep dives into history's most fascinating moments. And subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. Every subscriber helps. Thank you for watching.